Hello YouTube! So in this video, and hopefully some future ones, I'm going to talk about truth. Our primary question is going to be, what is the nature of truth? There are many propositions that we judge to be true, but what exactly is it that all these true propositions have in common? What is truth? What is it that makes a proposition true? This video is going to look at the correspondence theory of truth, but before getting into that, a quick advert. If you like my channel, you can support me on Patreon or with a one-off donation on PayPal. Any support you give is greatly appreciated. I offer private tutoring. Please email if you're interested in that. And feel free to join my Discord. A link will be in the description. Okay then. Now before we turn to the correspondence theory, it's worth stating a couple of preliminary points, just so we're clear about what it is that we're talking about in these videos. So first of all, there are many things that we might say are true or false. There are potentially many different truth bearers. So a truth bearer is just something that can be true or false. And so some potential truth bearers are propositions, sentences, statements, beliefs, thoughts, theories, hypotheses, models. I mean, we might say that a sentence is true, or a belief is true, or a theory is true. So we attribute truth to many different things. Now, there's a lot of debate among philosophers about what kinds of things can be genuine truth bearers. It would require a whole other video to get into that. Just to keep things simple, I'm going to talk about propositions. A proposition is the meaning of a sentence. So we would say that snow is white and the German sentence Schnee ist weiß express the same proposition because they have the same meaning, right? Snow is white and Schnee ist weiß mean the same thing. They both mean that snow is white. So different sentences can express the same proposition. The same sentences can express different propositions. The sentence, I am a philosopher, when I say it arguably expresses a different proposition than the sentence, I am a philosopher, when Frank Zappa says it. We're going to just talk about propositions here. We're going to assume that propositions are truth bearers. Not much of importance really turns on this, because the different theories of truth can be framed in terms of sentences or beliefs or thoughts or whatever else. But as I said, just to keep things simple, we'll talk about propositions. Okay, second preliminary point is that what we are interested in here is explaining the nature of truth, or perhaps even providing a definition of what truth is. There's a closely related question which concerns the criteria for determining whether or not a proposition is true. But these questions are different, and it's important not to conflate them. So Susan Hack, in her book Philosophy of Logics, has a very nice example that illustrates this distinction. Consider the question, what is a fever? Right? What is it to have a fever? When does a person count as having a fever? Well, a person has a fever just in case they have a temperature above the normal range, so above 37.5 degrees centigrade. We can then ask the additional question, what criteria do we use for determining whether somebody has a fever? Now, to answer this question, we would need to specify certain types of procedures. So things like placing a thermometer under the tongue. But these are different questions. The question of, well, what, just like by definition, what is a fever? That's a different question from what are the criteria for determining whether somebody has a fever? And we can draw the same distinction for theories of truth. Some theories of truth aim at giving a definition of what truth is. They aim at telling us the nature of truth. Other theories may aim at providing criteria to use for determining whether a proposition is true or false. Obviously, there are connections between these questions, but they are different questions. Our concern is going to be with the first question. What exactly is the nature of truth? And answering this question isn't necessarily going to tell you how to determine whether something is true. Right then, with those preliminary points out of the way, let's talk about truth. We're going to start with the correspondence theory. I'm starting with this one because I think it's probably the most intuitive, the most sort of commonsensical. Other theories of truth are easier to grasp once you have a sense of what the correspondence theory is, and in particular, why many philosophers think that it can't work. Now, there are many varieties of correspondence theory, but the basic idea is that some proposition P is true if and only if P corresponds to a fact, where a fact is a state of affairs in the world. So true propositions are those that correspond to the way the world is. So this is the correspondence theory. Number one, P is true if and only if P corresponds to a fact. Number two, P is false if and only if P fails to correspond to a fact. And I mean, this seems fairly straightforward, right? So let's take the proposition London is north of Madrid. This proposition describes two places, London and Madrid. It describes a spatial relation between them. We can think of this proposition as giving a kind of picture of how the world is. And it's easy to see how this works, right? So, I mean, first of all, so we have this sentence here, London is north of Madrid, and first of all, we just arbitrarily associate words with things in the world by convention. So the name London refers to a particular city. It picks out a particular city just by a convention of the language. We just stipulate that London refers to this place. And then similarly for other words. Okay, now we have concepts referring to things in the world. We can construct propositions that describe these things. And it may well be that the things in the world have the same structure as is given for the concepts in the proposition, in which case the proposition matches the states of affairs in the world. It corresponds to the world. So London is north of Madrid is true. What makes it true is that there's a place picked out by the name London, a place picked out by the name Madrid. These places are indeed related in the way the proposition describes. So we sort of have this, as shown in this little diagram here. And like the proposition gives us this sort of picture or this map. The world consists of individual things with particular properties related in particular ways, and the structure of the map corresponds to the structure of the world. Again, this is fairly simple, fairly obvious. This, I think, accounts for the primary appeal of the correspondence theory. It just seems intuitively like a very simple and commonsensical account of what it means to say that something is true. So one question is whether this simple story can be extended to more complex propositions. Many correspondence theorists have favoured a kind of reductionist approach. We've just seen that London is north of Madrid is true. We'll now consider another proposition, such as grass is green. With grass is green, we can tell much the same story that we did for London is north of Madrid. Grass is green refers to a particular kind, grass, it attributes the property of greenness to it, and this matches the facts. So we have two true propositions, London is north of Madrid and grass is green. To each of these propositions there corresponds a fact. But now suppose I form the conjunction, London is north of Madrid and grass is green. This proposition is also true, but to which fact does it correspond? There's a fact corresponding to London is north of Madrid, a fact corresponding to grass is green. Is there additionally a strange conjunctive fact corresponding to London is north of Madrid and grass is green? Similarly, consider the disjunction, London is north of Madrid or grass is blue. If the proposition London is north of Madrid is true, then we know that the disjunction London is north of Madrid or grass is blue is true. So do we have to postulate some special disjunctive fact that corresponds to this disjunction? It's not clear what this could be, right? Like, what exactly could like andness and orness be? As Bertrand Russell once put it, and I quote, "You must not look about the real world for an object which you can call or and say, now look at this. This is or." So the thought would be, well, look, in these cases, the truth of the complex proposition can be reduced to the truth of the simpler propositions. So we can see, given the logical relations between propositions, that postulating conjunctive and disjunctive facts is unnecessary. What makes London is north of Madrid and grass is green, that proposition, what makes that proposition true, are just the same two facts that make the proposition London is north of Madrid true and the proposition grass is green true. The truth of the conjunction can be straightforwardly reduced to the truth of each of its conjuncts. So a conjunction is true just in case both of its conjuncts are true. In general, if the proposition A is true and the proposition B is true, then the conjunction A and B is true just by default. The same point can be made for disjunction. If the proposition A is true, then the disjunction A or B is true by default. There's no conjunctive fact or disjunctive facts. So, you know, the truth of more complex propositions can be reduced to the truth of simpler propositions. At least that's, you know, one way that a correspondence theorist might elaborate on correspondence theory. And this raises an important point about correspondence theory. The correspondence theorist does not need to claim that every true proposition has its own unique fact, or that there's like a strict isomorphism between a true proposition and the facts. The same fact might make different propositions true. So here's another example of this kind of strategy. There is one chair in my room. Right? That's a fact about my room. There's one chair in it. This fact makes true the proposition, there is one chair in my room. But it also makes true the different proposition, there are fewer than 100 chairs in my room. I mean, you know, there is one chair in my room and there are fewer than 100 chairs in my room are clearly not the same proposition. They convey different information, but the same fact makes both of these propositions true. You know, so we have the fact that there's one chair in my room. We don't need to introduce some further fact, a fact of there being fewer than 100 chairs in my room. The fact that there is one chair in my room does the job. It makes both of these propositions true. So yeah, again, the point here is just we don't have to sort of have a unique fact for each true proposition, as long as we can kind of show that for these more complex propositions, we can reduce them to the truth of simpler propositions that do just correspond to the facts. Now, an important thing to note about the correspondence theory is that on the correspondence theory, a proposition either corresponds to the facts or it doesn't. And in principle, we might all be wrong about this. So London is north of Madrid is true, and it would be true even if nobody knew this, even if nobody had any way of determining this. The facts exist independently of our ability to discover them. So if we take a proposition such as there is life in the Andromeda galaxy, well, we don't know whether this is true. Perhaps we will never know. Perhaps it's impossible for us to establish this one way or the other. Even so, there's a fact of the matter here. I mean, either there are aliens in the Andromeda galaxy or there aren't. So the proposition, there is life in the Andromeda galaxy, that's either true or false, even if we can never discover whether it's true or false. So correspondence theory is usually associated with a kind of epistemic realism, right? The truth is independent of us and our activities. The truth may outstrip what we are able to know. If we're lucky, we can discover some of the truths, but there might be some truths that are just beyond our ability to discover. I mean, this is fairly commonsensical, but we will see in later videos, if I ever get around to them, that there are many theories of truth which are going to challenge this kind of realism. Okay then, so that's basically the correspondence theory. As I said, there are many different versions of correspondence theory, so you know what I've presented here is sort of, I suppose, a kind of simple way of being a correspondence theorist. The basic idea is just P is true, if and only if P corresponds to the facts. Right, simple idea. So let's turn to some problems, some objections. One of the central concerns about correspondence theory is the no independent access objection. Correspondence theory says that P is true just in case P corresponds to the facts, but we don't have any direct access to the facts. Well, I mean, maybe we have direct access to some facts, like facts about our own experience or whatever. But yeah, for many of the facts, we just have no direct access to them. So when I consider some proposition, say snow is white, well, I can't compare the proposition on the one hand with the fact on the other, right? The proposition snow is white with the fact that snow is white. When I evaluate the proposition that snow is white, how can I evaluate this? Well, I can consider my perceptions, my thoughts, my memories. I can consider testimony that I've received from other people. I can consider, background theories that I hold about the nature of the water cycle or whatever. So I can consider all of these things, all of these experiences. All of these experiences will help me assess whether that proposition is true. But obviously, what I can't do, I can't step outside of my own mind and see reality as it is in itself. I can't step outside of my mind and just see the facts. So if correspondence theory is right, the worry is that truth just becomes completely hidden from us. So that's the concern. What can the correspondence theorist say about this? Well, I think what we have to bear in mind here is the distinction that we drew at the beginning between giving a theory about the nature of truth and giving criteria for determining what propositions are true. Correspondence theory may well be a very poor criterion for determining truth, right? We can't step outside our own minds. We can't just compare a proposition to the mind-independent reality to check if they correspond. But whether or not we can do that is just tangential to the question of what truth is. So this no access objection seems to rest on the following assumption: that if truth equals F, then S knows that P is true only if S knows that P is F. So if truth is correspondence to the facts, then S knows that P is true only if S knows that P corresponds to the facts. But this kind of principle, if it's generalized to other concepts, seems pretty implausible. So here's a nice example from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy page on correspondence theory. Today, we think that water is H2O. Right? Water is just identical to H2O. They're the same thing. But we wouldn't want to say, we wouldn't say, well, if water is H2O, then S knows that X is water only if S knows that X is H2O. That principle seems totally implausible, right? I mean, David Hume, he knew that the Thames contained water. He didn't know that the Thames contained H2O because H2O had not even been discovered in his time. There are various means of determining whether something is water without determining that it is H2O. My sort of means of determining that what I have in the cup in front of me is water are not necessarily going to tell me that what I have in my cup is H2O. It took a hell of a lot of empirical research, experiments, conceptual development to get to the claim that what I have in the water is H2O. So similarly then, to know that a proposition is true does not require, stepping outside of one's mind and comparing it to the facts, right? To know that a proposition is true doesn't require establishing that it corresponds to a fact. There are various ways of determining that a proposition is true. We need not literally compare the proposition to a fact. The correspondence theory is a claim about the nature of truth in much the same way. So in the same way that, we might say water is H2O, we similarly say truth is correspondence to the facts. But you can establish that something is true without also knowing that or establishing that it corresponds to the facts. But this problem, this no access problem, is one of the kind of classic concerns about correspondence theory, and so we'll kind of come back to this probably in later videos. But that's one response the correspondence theorist might make here. Okay, another standard objection to correspondence theory is that not all truths can be accounted for as corresponding to facts. So the worry is that there might be truths without facts that make them true. So we'll just go through some potential examples here. There are many domains where this has been claimed. So one potential domain concerns moral truths. It is true, we might say, that slavery is wrong. Anybody who thinks that slavery is acceptable has made an error. But what is the fact in the world to which this corresponds? You know, like when we say slavery is wrong, I mean, okay, slavery happens in the world, but what about wrongness? What could wrongness be? I mean, this is particularly pressing if we take seriously the idea of propositions as picturing facts. You know, I can picture that London is north of Madrid, or indeed that London is south of Madrid. But what is a picture of wrongness? You know, or think about modal propositions, propositions concerning possibility, necessity, contingency. So I'm currently wearing a white shirt. I could have worn a blue shirt. Right? I mean, that's true. I could have worn a blue shirt. This proposition, I could have worn a blue shirt, this describes not an actual state of affairs, but a merely possible state of affairs. It's, you know, it's possible that I'm wearing a blue shirt, or that I was wearing a blue shirt. I'm not actually wearing a blue shirt. Now, what should the correspondence theorists say here? Right? Are there facts in the actual world that somehow make this true, or when I say I could have worn a blue shirt, does that correspond to a merely possible fact? And what the hell would a merely possible fact be? So do we have to postulate some realm of, you know, ghostly modal facts, merely possible facts, to make sense of modal truths? Then there are logical laws. So if P then Q and P, these jointly entail Q. Right? Q logically follows from if P then Q and P. So we have this entailment relation, right? If P then Q, P entails Q. But to what facts could this entailment relation correspond? The world itself doesn't seem to contain logical entailment relations. There are just, you know, things in their properties. So it's not again, it's not obvious that there are like facts or states of affairs to which entailment relations correspond. Finally, consider truths about the past. Suppose that presentism is correct, the view in philosophy of time that only present things exist. Well, it is true that thousands of years ago Caesar crossed the Rubicon, but if presentism is right, then Caesar doesn't exist. So, what is the fact to which this truth corresponds? You know, facts are supposed to be states of affairs in the world, but the state of affairs that made it true that Caesar crossed the Rubicon is now extinguished. That state of affairs no longer exists. It just doesn't exist. So, where what's the correspondence relation here? Now, of course, you know, presentism may be mistaken, maybe past things and future things do exist, but presentism is a metaphysical thesis. Presumably we can't show that it's mistaken just by appealing to our theory of truth. So these are some of the challenging cases that a correspondence theorist is going to face. Now, there are various strategies available for dealing with these purportedly problematic truths. So, broadly speaking then, here are three general strategies. One strategy is just to deny that the propositions in question are actually true. So if we think about the moral domain, we have views like non-cognitivism and error theory. In this case, a correspondence theorist will grant that there are no facts to which moral claims could correspond, and then she will conclude that there are just no moral truths. Actually, it's not true that slavery is wrong, because there just are no moral truths. A second option is we could try to extend the reductionist project that we discussed earlier. So maybe there are no irreducibly moral facts, but moral truths instead correspond to other types of facts that are unproblematic. This is the approach favoured by moral naturalists. Maybe moral truths correspond to facts about human well-being, for instance. You know, what makes it true that slavery is wrong is that slavery produces a great deal of suffering. A final strategy is to hold that there just are the facts in the purportedly problematic domain, right? There actually just are irreducibly moral facts. And all of these, you know, positions can be defended for, you know, with respect to different domains. So there are plenty of options open to the correspondence theorist here. But the point is that many propositions, you know, perhaps most propositions, are not going to be as easily matched up with the world as London is north of Madrid. So, when I was presenting correspondence theory, I sort of said, well, look, this is a really simple, really intuitive, commonsensical theory. But, it's simple and commonsensical if we stick with propositions like London is north of Madrid. But actually, when we start to consider a broader range of propositions, it's not really so obvious how we're going to kind of tie those propositions to facts in the world. And so, again, this isn't to say that a correspondence theorist can't do this, but it is to say that the correspondence theorist does have some work cut out for them. They're going to have to say something about a range of seemingly problematic propositions. Okay then, there are a number of objections to correspondence theory that target the nature of the correspondence relation, and so I will focus on three different problems here to do with the correspondence relation. So the question is, well, what does it even mean to say a proposition corresponds to a fact? Here's one concern, an early concern that was raised by Gottlob Frege. Suppose we say that the proposition London is north of Madrid corresponds to the fact that London is north of Madrid. Now, obviously, there are significant differences between this proposition and the fact. The proposition is a set of ideas or concepts related in a particular way. The fact, by contrast, consists of material objects, buildings, people, institutions, located at different points on the Earth's surface. So the proposition and the fact are pretty different. So it seems like they don't perfectly correspond. I mean, they certainly don't perfectly correspond. In fact, there's a dilemma here for the correspondence theorist. Suppose we were to claim, first of all, that the proposition and the fact share all of their properties. Well, in that case, it would seem that the proposition is just identical to the fact. But that's going to look pretty implausible, right? I mean, it's not obvious. Again, if we think of a proposition as being composed of concepts, there are different ways of thinking of propositions, but if we think of a proposition as being composed of concepts, then it's very implausible to say that the proposition and the fact are going to be just identical. But even if we do say that the proposition and the fact are identical, then talk of a proposition corresponding to a fact just wouldn't make any sense anymore. It's not going to be the case that we have one thing that corresponds to another thing, because they're not two things. There's just one thing. The proposition and the fact are actually just the same thing. So the second option would be to say that the proposition and the fact do have different properties. Well, in that case, yeah, we can talk about the proposition corresponding to the fact, but if they have different properties, then they can only correspond more or less, right? We can only say that they correspond to a certain degree. We might say that the proposition is similar to the fact, and of course two things can be more or less similar to each other. Or maybe the proposition resembles the fact in some way. Again, things can resemble each other to a greater or lesser degree. So if the proposition and the fact have different properties, then there would be degrees of correspondence. But, Frege says, truth can't then consist in correspondence, because there are not degrees of truth. A proposition is either true or false, and that's that. It makes no sense to say that a proposition could be partially true, very true, a little bit true. So that's the worry. What can the correspondence theorist say about this? Well, the correspondence theorist might object that actually we do often talk about things being partly true or approximately true. So this notion of degrees of truth isn't as implausible as Frege suggests. However, this maybe doesn't quite solve the problem here, because arguably notions like approximate truth or partial truth are derivative from pure truth and pure falsehood, right? So if I say that P is approximately true, well, that's just to say that P is, strictly speaking, false, right? Or at least that's that does follow, right? If P is approximately true, then it's not true. It's strictly speaking false. Moreover, if P is approximately true, then we need to have some notion of what it is that P is approximating. So to say that P is approximately true seems to require that there is some other proposition, P star, such that P star is strictly true and P is in some sense close to P star. But with that in mind, right? So talk of approximate truth is kind of derivative from talk of just truth and just falsehood, and now we run right back into Frege's dilemma. Is okay. How do we make sense of this idea of something being just true, right? If truth is cashed out in terms of correspondence. Okay, here's another concern about the correspondence relation. We can call this the many relations problem. This is discussed by Colin McGinn in his book Logical Properties. Similar arguments have been made by others. So we're assuming that the proposition London is north of Madrid corresponds to the fact that London is north of Madrid. But why not say that there's also a correspondence relation between the proposition London is south of Madrid and the fact that London is north of Madrid? So in general, when a proposition P corresponds to a fact F, why should it not also be the case that not P corresponds to F? I mean, actually, we know that there must be some sort of relation between not P and F, because we would say that F makes P false, right? The fact that makes the proposition false. So the fact that London is north of Madrid is what makes false the proposition it is not the case that London is north of Madrid. Just as there is a truth-making relation, it seems that there must also be a false-making relation, a falsity-making relation. But why isn't that a kind of correspondence relation? So the situation is this, right? London is north of Madrid is made true by the fact that London is north of Madrid. It is not the case that London is north of Madrid is made false by the same fact. In both cases, there's a relation between the proposition and the world. We can think of like a relation that like maps facts to propositions. If there is a relation mapping facts to those propositions they make true, then there's also a mapping from facts to those propositions they make false. So as McGinn puts it, there is a mapping from fact to proposition according to the making false rule. So, in fact, there is a kind of correspondence between false propositions and facts. So for every fact, there's going to be an infinite number of propositions. Some it makes true, the others it makes false. And there's some sense in which, given that there's this like mapping from facts to propositions that they make false, there's some sense in which they correspond. So by analogy, suppose that you are asked to compare two images, right? So first of all, we have these two images 1 and 2. Well, clearly there's a correspondence between these images. You can take each pixel in the first image and you can map it to each pixel in the second. Like each pixel, so the pixels in both images have the same color. So you can go like pixel by pixel, mapping 1 to 1, one pixel in the first to a pixel in the second by the same color relation, right? Black pixels map to black pixels, white pixels map to white pixels. Okay, fair enough. So we can say that image number 1 corresponds to image number 2. But now consider these two images. Well, in this case, the colors of one of the images have been inverted. But clearly there's still a correspondence between these images. So what's happening here is that the first image maps to the second image using the inverted color relation. Black pixels map to white pixels map to black pixels. Now, obviously you could transform this second image in all sorts of ways. I could flip it upside down, stretch it out, whatever. There's still going to be a mapping from this first image to the second. There's going to be a mapping from the parts of the first image to parts of the second. McGinn's point is that the same is true for facts and propositions. If there's a mapping from some fact to a proposition P, there must also be a mapping from that fact to the proposition not P. I mean, after all, negation is just a function that flips truth values, right? If P is true, not P is false. If P is false, not P is true. So it's similar to how you can invert the colours of a picture. So here's the problem then. There are many alternative ways of mapping a proposition to the world. How do we select any one of these mappings as the relevant correspondence relation? Well, McGinn points out that a natural way to fix this is to say that P is true if and only if P corresponds to the fact that makes P true. Obviously, that's just circular, right? We're asked to explain the nature of truth. Now we're just using truth to explicate itself. The fundamental problem here is there are countless relations between facts and propositions. So we need to say that for P to be true is specifically for there to be a truth-making correspondence relation. But that just leaves us completely in the dark as to the nature of truth. So McGinn concludes, correspondence has to be understood as truth-making correspondence or it won't work. Because there's also falsity-making correspondence. So correspondence has to be understood as truth-making correspondence or it won't work. And of course that just trivializes the theory. All right then, a final objection to correspondence theory is the slingshot argument. Slingshot argument was most famously presented by Donald Davidson. I'm not going to present exactly Davidson's version. His version, I think, is quite tricky, but there are other versions of it that are a bit more easier to follow. So anyway, the slingshot argument aims to show that if true propositions correspond to anything, then they all correspond to the same fact. They all correspond to the same thing. All true propositions correspond to the same thing. So the slingshot argument rests on two assumptions. Assumption A is that the truth maker for a proposition P is the truth maker for any proposition logically equivalent to P. So, I mean, this seems fair enough, I think, right? So if I say all men are mortal, well, that's logically equivalent to saying if X is a man, then X is mortal. It does seem that, whatever makes the first proposition true will be the same fact that makes the second proposition true. I mean, the reason is that, like, in some important sense, these logically equivalent propositions are saying the same thing, right? Like, these are just sort of different ways of rephrasing the same information. So the truth maker for P is the truth maker for any proposition logically equivalent to P. Principle B says that the truth maker for P is the truth maker for any proposition that is derived from P by substituting co-referring singular terms. So again, the idea here is, I think, very simple and pretty plausible. If we take the proposition London is north of Madrid, that's made true by the fact that London is north of Madrid. Now, London is the capital city of England. So this fact should also make true the proposition the capital city of England is north of Madrid. Right? So the proposition London is north of Madrid and the proposition the capital city of England is north of Madrid, they both correspond to the same fact. After all, the name London and the name the capital city of England, they're just conventional, right? Like, I mean, we use each of these terms to refer to the same thing, and it's just a kind of a matter of convention that we call it London or the capital city of England. Okay. So with these principles in mind, then, we can state the slingshot. I'm going to give two versions of it. Here's the version of the slingshot that was given by Alonzo Church. So he starts with the following claim. Number 1, Sir Walter Scott is the author of Waverley. Now, the author of Waverley is a description which refers to a particular person. So this proposition asserts an identity. The person referred to by the name Sir Walter Scott is the person referred to by the description, the author of Waverley. But we can replace this description with another description that has the same reference. So we can say, Sir Walter Scott is the man who wrote 29 Waverley novels altogether. Right? The description, the author of Waverley, and the description, the man who wrote 29 Waverley novels altogether, both refer to the same person. So we're substituting one description for another where they both have the same reference. So 1 and 2 are going to be true under exactly the same conditions. The fact that makes 1 true is the same as the fact that makes 2 true. Okay, but now we can rephrase 2. So instead of saying 2, we can say the number such that Sir Walter Scott wrote that many Waverley novels altogether is 29. Church takes it that 2 and 3 are synonymous, or at least close enough to be synonymous that they must have the same reference. 3 is like just a different way of phrasing 2. They seem to be logically equivalent. So the fact that makes 2 true should be the same as the fact that makes 3 true. Notice, however, that in 3 we have an identity statement that names the number 29, and it says that this is identical to the referent of the description, the number such that Sir Walter Scott wrote that many Waverley novels altogether. So we can replace this description with another description that has the same reference, which yields the number of counties in Utah is 29. So if we take the 2 descriptions, right, the number such that Sir Walter Scott wrote that many Waverley novels altogether, and the number of counties in Utah, these descriptions refer to the same thing. We're substituting one description for another that has the same reference. So the fact that makes 3 true will be the same as the fact that makes 4 true. So this is the overall argument then. Sir Walter Scott is the author of Waverley. Sir Walter Scott is the man who wrote 29 Waverley novels altogether. The number such that Sir Walter Scott wrote that many Waverley novels altogether is 29. The number of counties in Utah is 29. The fact that makes the first proposition true is the fact that makes the last proposition true. So if this is right, we have the result that the fact that makes it true that Sir Walter Scott is the author of Waverley must be the same as the fact that makes it true that the number of counties in Utah is 29. And that is a rather striking result. Okay, that's one version of the slingshot. I'm now going to give another version of the slingshot. So again, we're beginning with the assumptions that principle A, the truth maker for P, will be the truth maker for any proposition logically equivalent to P. Principle B, the truth maker for P will be the truth maker for any proposition derived from P by substituting co-referring singular terms. Alright, let's assume that P is true. Then, according to the correspondence theory, it is also true that, number 1, P corresponds to the fact that P. That's just the statement of the correspondence theory. Now we can substitute for the second P here any logically equivalent sentence. So, we could say that all men are mortal corresponds to the fact that all men are mortal, or we could say all men are mortal corresponds to the fact that if X is a man, then X is mortal, right? Both sentences pick out the same fact. So think about this. So consider this description. The number that is 1 if P and 0 if not P. That's a description, and from this we can form the sentence. The number that is 1 if P and 0 if not P equals 1. Now, this sentence, dP, is logically equivalent to P. These sentences have the same truth value under every interpretation. If P is true, then the identity expressed in dP is true, because if P is true, then the number that is 1 if P and 0 if not P does indeed equal 1. If P is false, then the identity expressed in dP is false, because if P is false, then the number that is 1 if P and 0 if not P does not equal 1, contrary to what is stated in dP. Okay, since P and dP are logically equivalent, then given the principle that we may substitute logically equivalent sentences, from number 1 we get 2. P corresponds to the fact that the number that is 1 if P and 0 if not P equals 1. So the number that is 1 if P and 0 if not P is a description, which refers to the number 1. And recall the principle that allows us to substitute co-referring terms. The truth maker for a proposition will be the truth maker for any other proposition derived by substituting co-referring terms. So consider any other true proposition Q. Well, then we can state the description, the number that is 1 if Q and 0 if not Q. Since Q is true, this description also designates the number 1, so we can substitute this for the description in 2, which, of course, will yield 3. P corresponds to the fact that the number that is 1 if Q and 0 if not Q equals 1. But the number that is 1 if q and 0 if not q equals 1, that is logically equivalent to q, for the same reason that dp is logically equivalent to p. So by substituting the logically equivalent sentences, we get 4, p corresponds to the fact that q. And this argument works no matter which true propositions we take for p and q. So again, here is the overall argument. Number 1, p corresponds to the fact that p. Number 2, p corresponds to the fact that the number that is 1 if p and 0 if not p equals 1. 3, p corresponds to the fact that the number that is 1 if q and 0 if not q equals 1. 4, p corresponds to the fact that q. So we start with, say, London is north of Madrid corresponds to the fact that London is north of Madrid, and then we end with London is north of Madrid corresponds to the fact that snow is white. Each of these is going to refer to the same fact. Each of these is going to be made true by the same fact. So it seems then that all true propositions correspond to the same fact, because obviously you can run this with any true propositions. There is a singular fact, a big fact, that is what makes true any true proposition. And again, it seems that this trivializes the correspondence theory. Okay then, so that's the end of that video. In this video, so we've examined, I suppose, a fairly simple version of the correspondence theory. There are other versions of correspondence theory, some of them designed to meet some of the objections that we've seen here. So, this isn't the end of the story of the correspondence theory, but that is all for now. So, thank you for watching. Goodbye.